I want to now turn to Dania and pose a question to her. Dania, I wonder if you think that's a fair assessment that Olivier just provided, and if you can speak to how the problems of environmental and racial justice might feed off one another or magnify each other.
Absolutely. Thank you. First, let me thank you and the Washington Center for Equitable Growth for inviting me to this important discussion. My area of expertise really brings me to this conversation maybe from a slightly different perspective than Professor Blanchard. And so how I tend to think about racial justice and environmental justice is really to break it into, I think, first understanding what has happened in the past that has direct and indirect consequences for the present circumstances. And then second, taking lessons from the past to create strategies that effectively address climate change in a racially equitable way. So in that sense, I think, what resonates with me from what Professor Blanchard was saying was, avoiding regressive solutions, right? Making sure to take into account the fact that there's intergenerational wealth and the like. But so first I'll talk about, what has happened in the past, right? So Elizabeth Yeampierre, who's the co-chair of the Climate Justice Alliance, has been quoted as saying, quote, "Climate change is the result of a legacy of extraction, of colonialism, of slavery," unquote. Right? This is a legacy that involved the confiscation and division of land for extractive purposes at the expense of Black and Indigenous communities that went on for centuries. Right? Extractive government policies contribute directly to the struggles in Indigenous communities for food and water security today. So to separate racial justice and climate justice, I think, is impossible. And so how has this manifest both structurally and more recently in the United States? The US government's practice of redlining in the 1930s excluded investment in Black communities, shifted resources to white communities, and when coupled with racism in housing markets, relegated Black families to the worst neighborhoods in cities across the US. Then, the government-sanctioned urban renewal projects of the 1950s and 1960s razed many Black neighborhoods, including strong Black middle-class enclaves, to the ground, destroying a sense of community and further depleting Black property ownership. And so these actions have real consequences for environmental equity today. Right? The neighborhoods where Black households live contribute to higher incidences of asthma and upper respiratory disease. The age of the housing stock increases the likelihood that children are exposed to lead contaminants that can negatively impact their cognitive development, right? And that has ripple effects for education inequalities as well. In a study published in Nature in March of this year, they showed that neighborhoods that were graded D on redlining maps, which were mostly Black and ethnic minority neighborhoods, have 23% tree canopy coverage today on average, while neighborhoods graded A have 43% coverage, right? Nearly twice as much. And so tree canopy coverage is important because it protects against the effects of heat islands, right, which is becoming increasingly important as climate change increases the incidences of heat waves and droughts. Right? Researchers at Tufts have been studying the health impacts of the smallest particulate pollution, which is 0.1 microns or smaller, which to my knowledge are not regulated by the EPA when they're that small. And so these particulates are small enough to go directly into the bloodstream and cause inflammation leading to cardiovascular disease. Where are these small particulates most present? Closest to highways, right? And these are the same highways that were cut directly through Black neighborhoods, right? So there's a history here that's directly linked to racial climate inequalities, health inequalities, and ripple effects for education inequalities. And so any climate solutions going forward needs to put positive weight on addressing these inequalities from the past that resonate into the present. And at the very least, they need to be solutions that do not continue to do further damage to these communities.